The hospital floor was cold against her cheek. Nurse Mara Solis lay face down on the linoleum outside Bay 4, blood running from her split lip, the crash cart she'd been shoved into still rattling against the wall behind her. 3 doctors walked past. One glanced down. Not one of them stopped. The charge nurse at the station 20 feet away turned back to her computer screen. In 14 years of military medicine, 4 deployments, 2 field hospitals, 1 night in a collapsed building in a country most people couldn't find on a map, Mara Solis had never once been left on the floor. She pressed her palm flat and pushed herself up. In less than 4 hours, those same people would be screaming her name. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where the stories nobody tells finally get told. Like this video, drop a comment, and tell me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Mara Solis and the night Hargrove Memorial Hospital learned exactly who they had been stepping on. Hargrove Memorial Hospital sat at the edge of Caldwell Ridge, Colorado, the kind of mid-sized mountain city that felt like it was always bracing for something. Winters that came early, summers that burned hot and fast, and a civic pride that occasionally tipped into something uglier. The hospital had been the crown jewel of Caldwell Ridge for 30 years. 412 beds, a level 2 trauma center, a cardiac wing that had been named after a donor who'd never spent a single night in the building. Its hallways smelled like antiseptic and institutional carpet, and the particular staleness of recycled air, and to the people who ran it, that smell was the smell of authority. Mara Solis had been working there for 11 months. She had taken the job because it was the closest trauma-certified position to her mother's house in Pueblo, and because after 8 years in the Army, the last 4 as a Special Operations Medical Sergeant attached to units whose names she was still not permitted to say out loud, she needed something that resembled a normal life. She was 34 years old. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they've seen things that changed how they hear sound. She did her job with an economy of motion that made newer nurses nervous and made the good doctors respect her, and she did not volunteer information about herself unless someone asked directly. Almost nobody asked directly. What the staff of Hargrove Memorial saw when they looked at Mara Solis was a travel nurse who'd somehow gotten a permanent position. A woman of mixed Latina and Filipino heritage who wore her dark hair pulled back tight and kept her expression steady in a way some people read as coldness and others read as arrogance. She was not a physician. She did not have the right last name or the right golf club membership or the right relationship with the right administrator. In the social architecture of Hargrove Memorial that put her somewhere below the residents and somewhere above the janitorial staff, and the people who ran that architecture enforced it with the casual cruelty of people who have never once had to question their own position in it. The man at the center of that architecture was Dr. Randall Cutler, chief of surgery, 51 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that had been athletic 20 years ago and was now just bulk. He had the particular confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional so many times, and for so long that he had stopped being able to distinguish between the truth and the performance of it. He wore his white coat like a uniform and moved through the hospital corridors as if the other people in them were set dressing. His surgical outcomes were adequate. His political instincts were extraordinary. And his ability to identify and neutralize threats to his position was, by any measure, the sharpest skill he possessed. He had identified Mara Solis as a threat on her 3rd day. She had been in Bay 7, assisting on a consult with one of the younger attendings, Dr. Priya Nath, when she'd quietly pointed out that the dosing protocol they were preparing for a post-surgical patient was wrong. Not wrong in a gray area, arguable way, but wrong in a way that would have caused a dangerous drug interaction within 6 hours. Dr. Nath had caught it immediately, corrected it, and thanked her. The patient never knew. But 2 nurses at the station had seen it happen, and one of them had mentioned it to someone. And by the following Tuesday, Dr. Cutler had heard about it 3 separate times, always framed as an observation about a nurse who seemed to think she knew more than the doctors. Cutler had walked down to the ER that afternoon and stood at the charge desk until Mara looked up. "Solis," he'd said. "Dr. Cutler. I hear you've been offering clinical opinions." She'd met his eyes without flinching. "I flagged a medication interaction. Dr. Nath confirmed it and made the correction." "Dr. Nath is a physician. You're a nurse. Do you understand the difference?" "I understand it very well." He'd looked at her for a long moment, long enough to be deliberate, and then he'd walked away without another word. And Mara had known, with the same bone-level certainty she'd learned to trust in the field, that something had just started that wasn't going to end cleanly. She had been right. The next 8 months had the quality of a slow erosion. Nothing dramatic at first. Scheduling shifts that buried her in the administrative overflow when high-acuity cases were coming through. The cases she was qualified to handle and the residents weren't. Performance reviews that described her as overly independent and resistant to team protocols, despite the fact that her patient outcomes were measurably better than the floor average. A formal complaint from a senior nurse named Dale Ostrowski, who described a shift during which Mara had refused to defer to attending judgment, a complaint that was vague enough to be unfalsifiable and specific enough to go in her file. Ostrowski had been with Cutler's social group for 6 years. He played poker every second Friday at Cutler's house in the Highlands. These facts were not coincidences, and Mara did not treat them as coincidences. She documented everything: dates, times, names, what was said. She kept a separate log on an encrypted drive she kept at her apartment, not because she had a plan yet, but because documentation was a reflex she'd developed in environments where paperwork was the difference between an incident and an investigation. She lodged one formal HR complaint in March regarding a scheduling manipulation that had left her covering a double shift without advance notice, while a less experienced nurse was given her original rotation. HR acknowledged receipt. Nothing happened. She filed a second complaint in May, after Ostrowski made a comment in front of 4 other nurses about her military fantasies, a phrase that managed to be dismissive and insinuating at the same time. HR acknowledged receipt. Nothing happened. By June, the physical dimension had begun. It started small. A shoulder check in the corridor that was just a little too hard to be accidental. A supply cart repositioned so that it swung into her hip when she opened Bay 3's door. The kind of contact that was easy to explain away individually and formed a pattern only if you were the person absorbing it. Mara had operated in environments where the violence was explicit and aimed and came with sound. This was different, quieter, deniable, designed to make her question her own perception. She did not question her own perception. She added to her log. The night everything broke into the open was a Tuesday in late July. She had been working the evening shift, 11 to 7, and the ER had been the particular kind of busy that keeps everyone moving without ever quite tipping into chaos. 4 chest pains, 2 MVAs, a pediatric respiratory case that had resolved cleanly, a steady supply of the smaller emergencies that kept the department's numbers up, and its staff tired. At 2:14 a.m., she had been pushing a medication cart back toward the supply room when a hand came from behind her and shoved, not pushed, shoved, the cart hard into her body, catching her across the ribs and sending her stumbling sideways into a crash cart, which had rolled and tipped and taken her down with it onto the linoleum floor. She had hit the floor face first. The corner of the crash cart had caught her lip. She lay there for a moment, not from injury, but from the particular stillness that comes when your body is processing what just happened before your mind catches up. The corridor was not empty. There were at least 4 people within visual range. She heard footsteps recede behind her. She pushed herself up. The name she'd half-registered before she hit the ground was Kyle Ostrowski. Dale Ostrowski's younger brother, an ER tech who had been brought on 4 months ago through a process that no one in the department could clearly explain. Kyle was 26 and large, and had the particular meanness of someone who has spent his life operating under protection he didn't earn. She got to her feet. She pressed the back of her hand against her lip and looked at the blood. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph of her reflection in the glass panel of the medication cabinet. Split lip, torn scrub collar, the red mark along her jaw. And then she put her phone back in her pocket and finished her shift. At 6:40 in the morning, 20 minutes before she clocked out, she submitted a formal incident report, attaching the photograph, documenting the time, the location, the presence of witnesses, and the name of the individual she believed responsible. She described the contact as a deliberate physical assault. By 8:15, Dr. Cutler had called her into his office. She had not gone home. She had not slept. She stood in front of his desk in her scrubs with dried blood still at the corner of her mouth, and looked at him with an expression she had learned in places where losing your composure cost people their lives. Cutler sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his expression composed in something that was calibrated to look like concern but was really a kind of measured patience, the way a man looks when he's decided how a conversation is going to end before it begins. "I've reviewed your incident report," he said. "All right. I want to be direct with you, Mara. These kinds of allegations against a staff member without clear evidence create significant problems for the department. I have a photograph. There were 4 witnesses in the corridor. Witnesses who saw an accident involving a supply cart. No one has come forward to corroborate an intentional act." Mara looked at him. "No one has come forward yet. I submitted the report 2 hours ago." "I understand that." He leaned back. "But I want you to think carefully about what you're doing here. You've been a difficult fit in this department. I say that not as a criticism, but as an observation. The team dynamic here, Dr. Cutler." Her voice was level. "Kyle Ostrowski deliberately shoved that card into me. I have documentation of 6 prior incidents involving physical contact, 3 formal HR complaints, and a pattern of coordinated scheduling abuse going back 9 months. If you're about to suggest that I withdraw the incident report, I want you to understand that I'm recording this conversation." She was not recording the conversation, but she watched his hands, and they went still. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "I think," he said slowly, "that this department may not be the right environment for your particular style of practice." "I think I'd like that in writing," she said. "And I think I'd like HR present when you put it in writing." She walked out. She went home. She slept for 3 hours on top of her made bed with her boots still on, because she had learned how to sleep in exactly that position in places where you needed to be able to move in under 4 seconds. And she woke up when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. "We've been watching what's happening to you. You're not the only one." She stared at the message for a long moment, then set her phone face down on the nightstand and went back to sleep. She would deal with it later. Later turned out to be the following afternoon, when she arrived for her shift and found her access badge deactivated at the ER entrance. She stood at the door and pressed the badge against the reader a second time, and the light blinked red again, and the door did not open. A nursing student coming through behind her held it as he passed, and she walked through with him, and she went to the charge desk and asked for the supervisor, and the supervisor, a woman named Janet, who had always been professionally neutral toward Mara, neither hostile nor warm, pulled her aside with an expression that was clearly uncomfortable. "Your access has been suspended pending a review." "What review?" "A formal performance investigation. HR initiated it this morning." Mara had looked at Janet, and Janet had looked back, and in that exchange there was a kind of recognition that didn't require words, the acknowledgement of a woman who knew exactly what was happening here and was not in a position to say so out loud. "When did the investigation open?" Mara asked. "This morning. The notice would have come to your email." "The investigation opened the morning after I submitted an incident report alleging physical assault." Janet did not answer. "I want to speak to the HR director, in person, today." "I can try to schedule, today. Right now, if possible. This is retaliation for a protected complaint, and I want to be very clear that I understand that, and I want whoever is making decisions in that office to understand that I understand it." Janet's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been, in a different context, a kind of reluctant respect. She picked up the phone. Mara waited. The HR director, a man named Douglas Farr, agreed to see her at 3 o'clock. At the meeting, accompanied by a union representative she'd called from the parking lot, Mara laid out a detailed timeline, 9 months of documentation, photographs, HR complaints, with acknowledgement timestamps, the text message from the unknown number, the conversation with Cutler that she'd noted in writing immediately after leaving his office. Farr's face went through several careful transitions during the presentation, and when she finished, he told her the investigation would take 2 to 3 weeks and that her access suspension would remain in place during that time. The union rep, a sharp older woman named Tricia, who smelled like coffee and had ink on her left hand, leaned forward and said, "My client was physically assaulted on the floor of your ER. 2 to 3 weeks is not an appropriate timeline." "I understand your concern," Farr said. "I'd like confirmation that Dr. Cutler and Kyle Ostrowski are also under review," Mara said. Farr said he couldn't speak to the specifics of other personnel matters. Mara said, "I'd like that confirmed in writing within 48 hours, or my next conversation is with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies and an employment attorney." She walked out into the parking lot at 4:17 p.m. The afternoon was hot and dry, and the mountains sat against the sky with the flat, indifferent presence of things that had been there before the hospital existed and would be there after it was gone. Her ribs hurt where the cart had caught her. Her lip had scabbed over. She sat in her car with the windows down and called her mother in Pueblo and talked for 20 minutes about nothing, about a recipe, about the neighbor's new dog, about a television show her mother liked. And when she hung up, she sat for another minute in the quiet and then started the car. She had no idea what was going to happen with the investigation. She had no idea whether Farr would move on it honestly or whether the system would fold the way systems tended to fold when powerful men applied the right kind of pressure. What she knew was that her documentation was solid, that her complaint was legally protected, that she had a union rep and a credible record, and that Randall Cutler had spent 9 months underestimating what he was dealing with. She drove home, made dinner, reviewed her log. At 10:47 p.m., she received a voicemail from Douglas Farr's office, informing her that, effective immediately, her employment at Hargrove Memorial Hospital was suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the formal investigation, citing concerns about professional conduct, patient safety protocols, and workplace conduct standards. She listened to the voicemail twice. Then she pulled up the recording of her meeting with Farr, confirmed it had saved cleanly, saved it to 3 separate locations, and forwarded a summary of the day's events to Trisha's email with a note that said, "Retaliation has escalated to suspension without pay. Let me know when you can talk." She went to bed at midnight. At 11:49 p.m., before she'd fallen asleep, her phone lit up with a news alert from the Caldwell Ridge local news app she kept for weather and road conditions. Breaking: multi-vehicle collision on I-70 near Caldwell Ridge. Preliminary reports indicate commercial truck involved. Multiple casualties. Emergency services responding. She read it twice. She set the phone back on the nightstand. She lay there in the dark, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about the ER she'd been locked out of, and the patients who were about to come through its doors, and the residents who were going to have to manage whatever was rolling toward that hospital right now without adequate senior support, because the ER supervisor was a political appointee, and the trauma coordinator was on vacation, and the last person in that building with real mass casualty experience had been suspended 11 hours ago. She reached for her phone. She was not going to call Farr. She was not going to call Cutler. She was not going to beg for access or negotiate her way back through the door on someone else's terms. She was going to get dressed, and she was going to drive to Hargrove Memorial, and she was going to stand in that parking lot with her badge deactivated and her employment suspended. And she was going to watch what happened when a trauma center that had just hollowed out its own competence tried to handle a mass casualty event with the people it had left. And if that building needed her, when it needed her, they were going to have to come outside and ask. The news alert updated as she pulled on her jacket. The casualty count had been revised upward. A second vehicle had been involved. A tanker. There were reports of fire. Mara Solis tied her boots, picked up her keys, and walked out into the night. The drive to Hargrove Memorial took 9 minutes. Mara knew because she counted, not deliberately, just the way her brain had always worked under pressure, breaking time into units small enough to manage. 9 minutes from her apartment parking lot to the hospital's main entrance, and in those 9 minutes, the radio cycled through 2 updates on the I-70 incident that each contained more information than the last, and each was worse than the one before it. A commercial freight truck had lost control on the westbound descent approaching the Caldwell Ridge interchange. It had crossed the median barrier and struck an eastbound tanker carrying industrial solvent. The tanker had ruptured and caught fire. A passenger van, charter, 16 seats, had been caught in the secondary impact. 4 additional vehicles. The fire had spread to a section of the highway embankment. Emergency services were on scene, but the fire was complicating extraction. The number of confirmed injured kept moving. She parked in the employee lot out of habit, then remembered her badge wouldn't work and moved to the visitor structure. She killed the engine and sat for a moment listening to the scanner app she'd pulled up on her phone. She still had her paramedic frequencies from the Army, out of date but close enough. And what she heard in the voices on that frequency was the particular kind of controlled noise that meant people were managing, barely, and the volume was about to exceed what managing could handle. She got out of the car and walked to the ER entrance and stopped. The ambulance bay was already moving. 2 units sat with their rear doors open, paramedics transferring patients at a pace that wasn't quite running but was close. Through the glass doors, she could see the charge desk lit up, nurses moving, the particular geometry of a department switching into a higher gear. From outside, it looked like organized response. She had been inside enough trauma events to know that organized response and actual capacity were not the same thing, and the gap between them was where people died. Her badge beeped red at the reader. She stood outside the sliding doors in the warm night air and watched. The first wave came in 11 minutes. 4 ambulances and a loose convoy, radios crackling, paramedics calling out status as they pushed gurneys through the bay doors. Mara could hear fragments from where she stood. Tension pneumothorax. Burns to 40%. Unresponsive, GCS 6. Femur fracture with arterial involvement. She watched the doors and counted, because counting was what she did, and what she counted was this. 2 attending physicians visible in the bay, one of them Dr. Priya Nath, who was a good internist and a competent general physician and who had not trained for this. The other was a surgical resident named Marcus Webb, 29 years old, 8 months out of his intern year, who Mara had worked alongside enough to know he was smart and willing and not yet ready for what was about to walk through those doors. She did not see the trauma surgeon who was supposed to be on overnight call. She did not see the ER medical director, Dr. Sandra Vaught, who was supposed to provide senior oversight for mass casualty events. She did not see anyone who resembled a charge authority for a department that was about to receive 20-plus critically injured patients. What she saw was Priya Nath stopping for half a second in the middle of the bay with a clipboard in her hand and her eyes moving across 4 simultaneous situations, and her face doing something private and complicated before she forced it back under control and moved to the nearest gurney. Mara pressed her badge against the reader a third time. Red. She pulled out her phone and called Trisha. Trisha picked up on the second ring, which told Mara she was already awake, which told her Trisha had also seen the news. "I'm outside the ER," Mara said. "Badge is deactivated. There's a mass casualty event incoming, and I can see from the parking lot that they're short on senior trauma support." "How short?" 2 physicians visible in the bay, 1 internist, 1 second-year surgical resident. Trauma surgeon on call is either inside or not here. I don't know which. "Your suspension is in effect," Trisha said. "If you go in there without authorization and something goes wrong, something's already going wrong. I need you to tell me where I stand legally if I present myself at the entrance and request emergency access under patient safety grounds." There was a pause. "That's a gray area and you know it." "I know. Tell me anyway." "If there's a documented patient safety emergency and you have relevant credentials and you make the offer and they accept, you're operating under implied authorization. If they don't accept, you walk. You don't push through. You don't argue in the moment. You document that you offered." "Understood." "Mara." Trisha's voice shifted. "Be careful which war you're fighting tonight." Mara hung up and walked to the ambulance bay entrance, which was propped open with a doorstop because equipment was still moving through it, and she stepped inside. The smell hit her first, blood and scorched fabric, and the chemical edge of whatever was burning on that highway, carried in on the clothes and skin of the people coming through. Her nervous system recognized it before her conscious mind did, and something in her posture changed without her deciding it. The particular alignment of someone whose body knows it's in a working environment. A nursing aide nearly walked into her and pulled up short. "You can't be in here. Where's your trauma attending?" The aide blinked. "Dr. Osei he's not responding to pages. They've been trying to reach him for... Who's running the floor?" "Dr. Nath is trying to coordinate, but there's a lot coming in and she's..." Mara was already moving. She found Priya Nath at Bay 2, standing over a patient with burns across his upper torso and arms, one hand on his wrist and one hand hovering over a chart she hadn't finished writing, her eyes moving between the patient and the door to Bay 4, where a monitor had just started alarming. Nath was holding it together, but her jaw was tight in the way that meant she'd been clenching it for a while, and there were 2 nurses flanking her who were waiting for direction they weren't getting fast enough. "Dr. Nath." Nath looked up. For a fraction of a second, her expression did something involuntary. Relief, quickly smothered by wariness. "Mara, you can't be here. I know what I am. Your trauma attending isn't responding. You've got a mass casualty event in progress with at least 14 more inbound based on the scanner. I'm telling you what I can do and I'm asking you to make a decision." Nath stared at her. The monitor in Bay 4 was still alarming. "What can you do?" Nath said. "Combat trauma. Mass casualty triage, start protocol and beyond. Field surgical assist for thoracic and abdominal. Airway management, including surgical airway. I've run trauma response for events with higher volume than this, with less support than you have in this building. You're a nurse. Yes. Mara did not look away. Your call. Nath looked at the alarming monitor, looked at the bay doors, looked at Mara. Don't do anything I don't authorize, she said. Step outside my authority and I can't protect you. Understood. Nath moved to bay 4. Mara turned to the 2 nurses who had been watching. Names. Deja, said the first one, 20-something, cornrows, steady hands. Felix, said the second, older, heavy-set, looking like he hadn't expected this shift to go this way. Deja, Felix. I need current status on every bay, every patient, and every piece of equipment we have available. Not the chart status, what you're actually looking at. Start now. They started. Over the next 11 minutes, the second wave arrived. 7 more patients, 3 of them critical. A highway patrol officer with a traumatic brain injury and a blown pupil. A woman in her 40s with burns and a tension pneumothorax developing in real time. Mara heard it in her breathing from 6 feet away, the tracheal deviation already beginning. A teenage boy from the charter van, both femurs fractured, blood pressure dropping, the math of his blood loss already doing the thing where it stopped adding up. 2 others with injuries that were serious but stable enough to queue. 1 patient who arrived with CPR in progress. The patient with CPR in progress was Marcus Webb's problem for the next 4 minutes, and Mara watched him work while she was simultaneously managing the pneumothorax patient's chest. And what she saw in Webb was someone fighting, not panicking, fighting, but fighting without a map. Webb, she said, without looking up from her own patient. Busy, he said. I know. What rhythm are you looking at? PEA, cause unknown. Mechanism of injury? Blunt thoracic, steering column impact. Tension pneumo presenting as PEA. Check the trachea and breath sounds right now before you run another cycle. A pause. Then, tracheal deviation. Left side reduced breath sounds. Needle decompression. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular. You know how to do it. I know how. Then do it. I can't do it for you. I'm occupied. She heard him work. She was managing her own patient's chest drain with her left hand and keeping track of the teenage boy's pressure with her right eye on his monitor. And she was aware, in the way she had learned to be aware, distributed, peripheral, constantly updating, of every other active situation in the room. Her pneumothorax patient gasped, then breathed. The resistance in the chest released. The oxygen saturation started climbing. From across the room, the flat line of Webb's monitor spiked into a rhythm. Deja caught Mara's eye and said nothing, but her expression said something. The teenage boy's pressure was at 72/40 and falling. Felix, Mara said. ONEG is already up? Running now. 2 more units ready. He's going to need the OR in under 15 minutes or we're going to lose him. Who's available upstairs? Dr. Cutler was paged. He's not. Who else? Dr. Tamboli. She's in an elective procedure. They're trying to close her out. Call upstairs directly. Tell them this patient is 15 minutes from the point of no return and Dr. Tamboli needs to be in a trauma bay, not a procedure room. Use those words exactly. Don't ask. Tell. Felix was already on the phone. The next phase of the night had a quality that Mara recognized from 2 specific deployments and one night in a valley in a country that was now just a map reference in her memory. It was the quality of time compressing and expanding simultaneously, each individual task feeling very close and detailed and slow, the overall landscape moving very fast and loud around the edges. She had learned, in that environment, to stop trying to reconcile the 2 experiences and simply inhabit both of them. It was not a skill that could be taught in a classroom. She moved through the bays with the economy of motion that had irritated so many people in this building over the past 11 months. The stillness at her core that other people read as coldness, but was actually just conservation, of energy, of attention, of the particular currency of focus that mass casualty events spent very fast. She did not narrate what she was doing. She did not reassure people with words. She directed, she positioned, she corrected technique with 1 sentence or 2 and moved on, and the nurses who had been nervous and untethered began to find something to anchor to, and the rhythm of the room, which had been irregular and frantic and on the edge of fragmenting, started to cohere. Dr. Tamboli arrived from upstairs at 7 minutes, which was faster than Mara had calculated, which meant either that Felix had delivered the message well, or that Tamboli was the kind of surgeon who came running when running was what the situation required. She was 53, compact, gray at her temples, and she walked into the trauma bay and assessed the teenage boy in about 4 seconds and said, "Or3 is prepping. Who stabilized him?" "Joint effort," Deja said, with a precision that Mara noted. Tamboli looked at Mara. "You're the suspended nurse." "Yes." Tamboli looked at the teenage boy's improving numbers, looked back at Mara, said nothing further, and went with her patient. The highway patrol officer with the TBI was the one that nearly undid her, not because the case was beyond her. She had managed worse, but because the officer's partner was in the corridor outside the bay, a young woman, 24 maybe, in a torn uniform with blood on her sleeve that didn't appear to be her own, standing with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat to it the way people stand when they're trying to transfer their own anxiety into something solid and stationary. Every time the monitor alarmed, the partner flinched. She wasn't in the way. She wasn't making noise. She was just there, and she was terrified, and nobody had said a single word to her. Mara caught Deja's eye and tilted her head toward the corridor. Deja understood. She went to the partner, spoke quietly, put a hand on her arm, and guided her gently toward the family waiting area. It cost Deja 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds mattered because everything cost something tonight, and Mara had made a deliberate decision to spend them because the partner was starting to hyperventilate, and a hyperventilating police officer in the corridor of a trauma bay was a variable that would eventually cost more than 90 seconds to manage. The TBI patient was stabilized. Not saved, not yet, that was going to take a neurosurgeon and time, but stabilized enough to move. By 2:40 a.m., the incoming rate had slowed enough that the department could breathe. Not recover. The bays were still full. The monitors were still alarming at intervals. The supply of critical patients had not dried up, but had reduced to something the remaining staff could track. Mara stood at the supply station and cataloged what had been used and what needed restocking, not because it was her job, but because someone needed to know, and she was the one who knew the fastest. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed it the way she always noticed it, after, never during. She was doing inventory when she heard Cutler's voice. He had apparently been located, finally, by a nursing supervisor who had driven to the residential area where he lived and knocked on his door. He came in through the main entrance at 2:53 a.m. in street clothes, his hair not quite together, moving with the particular energy of someone who is very angry and is using the anger to cover the fact that they are aware of how their absence is going to look. He came through the ER doors and stopped in the middle of the floor and looked at the organized aftermath of what had happened. The patients in the bays, the staff moving with a purposefulness that had not been there before midnight, the evidence written on every surface of a department that had been pushed to its edge and had not broken, and his eyes moved until they found Mara. The way his face changed was not quite what she'd expected. She'd expected anger. What she saw was something more complicated. Anger, yes, but underneath it a kind of recognition that landed in his body before it reached his expression. The recognition of someone who has walked into a room and understood, before anyone has said a word, that something has shifted in a way that is going to be very difficult for him. "Who authorized you to be in this building?" he said. It wasn't phrased as a question. Dr. Nath stepped forward. "I did. Under patient safety emergency provisions. We had a mass casualty event with no trauma attending available, and I exercised clinical authority to request additional support. You're not authorized to countermand an HR suspension. The hospital's mass casualty protocol supersedes HR administrative actions during declared emergency periods. That's in the operations manual, section 14, paragraph 3. Nath's voice was perfectly even. She had clearly decided something tonight, and the decision had made her very calm. Mara provided critical clinical support during a period when our trauma attending was unreachable, and several patients would likely not have survived without her intervention. Cutler looked at Mara. "This isn't over." "I know," she said. He turned and walked toward his office, and the room stayed very quiet until his footsteps were gone. And then Deja let out a breath that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. And Felix straightened his shoulders, and Marcus Webb sat down on a supply cart with his elbows on his knees and his head down in the posture of someone who had given everything and had nothing left and was not ashamed of either fact. Mara leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for approximately 10 seconds, which was all she permitted herself, and then she opened them and went back to the inventory. At 4:17 a.m., a paramedic captain who had been coordinating the field response came through the ER entrance to check on a patient and stopped when he saw her. Solis? She looked up. His name was Garrett Vance. She knew him from a multi-agency disaster drill 8 months ago, one of 2 events during her time at Hargrove, where she had actually been allowed to operate in a capacity that matched her training. "Hey, Garrett." "They said the hospital had it under control," he said. He was looking at the organized bays, the stable monitors, the throughput that had not collapsed. "I thought they were just saying that." "They do have it under control." He looked at her. "Who ran triage?" She didn't answer. He looked at her for another moment, then looked at Deja, who was restocking at the adjacent station, and Deja looked back at him with an expression that was completely neutral. "Right," Garrett said quietly. He nodded once and went to find his patient. At 4:49 a.m., Marcus Webb came to find her. He looked like someone had taken all the air out of him and put most of it back in the wrong order, but his eyes were clear, and when he sat down on the stool across from where she was updating the equipment log, he looked at her directly. "I need you to tell me something," he said. "Depends what?" "The tension pneumo presenting as PEA. That call. I would not have gotten there, not in time. I've been running it back, and I'm telling you, I don't know when I would have gotten there." Mara looked at him. "You got there. Because you told me where to look. Now you know to look there. Next time you'll get there on your own." He was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take you to be able to do what you did tonight? See it all at once like that?" She thought about that honestly, because he was asking honestly, and he deserved a real answer. "I don't know. It built over time, and I wasn't watching it build. You do enough of it in conditions where the cost of a mistake is someone's life, and eventually your brain reorganizes itself around that fact. Where did you—" He stopped, started again differently. "You weren't doing nursing school rotations when you learned this." "No," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to ask more, but he was also smart enough to recognize that she'd answered what she was going to answer. "Thank you," he said, simply. No inflation on it. She nodded once and went back to the log. The hospital settled into the particular exhausted rhythm of 5 a.m. Not quiet, not recovered, but no longer in crisis. Mara finished her work. She checked in on the burn patient from Bay 2, who was stable and sedated. She confirmed that the teenage boy had made it into surgery with Tamboli, whose OR team had texted down an update that was cautiously good. She noted in writing, on the ER log, every intervention she had made that night, every patient she had assisted, every clinical decision she had flagged or participated in. She signed it with her full name and her nursing license number. Then she went to find Dr. Nath, who was in the small break room at the back of the department with a cup of coffee she'd apparently forgotten to drink, staring at a wall. "Thank you for authorizing my access," Mara said from the doorway. Nath turned. She looked exhausted in the bone-deep way that didn't come from a single bad night, but from a lot of them stacked in sequence. "I need you to know," she said, "that I wasn't doing you a favor. I made a clinical decision." "I know that." "Whatever Cutler does with it, that's between you and Cutler," Mara said. "I'm not asking you to defend me. I'm thanking you for making a call that needed to be made." Nath looked at her for a moment. "Where did you actually come from, Mara? Because you have not been a nurse your whole life, the way you worked tonight. That's not something you learn in a hospital." Mara looked back at her. In the cold fluorescent light of the break room at 5 in the morning, after a night that had taken something from both of them and given something back in a form neither of them would have chosen, she considered telling Priya Nath the truth. Instead, she said, "Get some sleep when you can." And she walked back out through the ER, past the bays and the monitors and the nurses who looked up when she passed with something in their faces that had not been there before, past the ambulance bay and through the sliding doors and out into the early morning. The sky was beginning to lighten over the mountains. Not yet dawn, just the first suggestion of it. A shift in the dark rather than an actual color. She sat on the concrete barrier at the edge of the ambulance bay. She was cold and tired, and her ribs still ached from the cart, and her lip had reopened at some point during the night without her noticing. She had no idea what was going to happen to her employment status in the morning. She had no idea whether Cutler was in his office right now, drafting the next step in a process that was going to try to bury everything she'd done tonight under paperwork and politics and institutional weight. What she knew was that 7 people who had been on the edge of not surviving the night had moved back from that edge, and she had been part of why. She pulled out her phone to call her mother, then remembered it was 5 a.m. and put it back in her pocket. Behind her, through the sliding doors, she heard a voice she didn't recognize. Not a nurse, not a resident, a different register entirely. Clipped, precise, carrying with it the particular weight of someone accustomed to being heard without raising their volume. She turned. Through the glass, she could see 2 men in the ER entrance, neither of them in hospital clothes. Dark jackets, despite the heat. One of them had what looked like a federal identification case in his hand, open, showing it to the nursing supervisor at the charge desk. The nursing supervisor pointed. Not into the building. Out. Through the glass door, the man's eyes found Mara on the concrete barrier outside. He said something to his partner. His partner nodded. They both came through the sliding doors and walked toward her, and the one with the ID case did not reach for it again, which told her he'd already decided this was not that kind of conversation. "Mara Solis?" he said. She looked at him. He was 40, maybe 42. Short hair, recently cut. Posture that said military background even in civilian clothes, because some things don't come out in the wash. "Depends who's asking," she said. He reached into his jacket. Not for the ID case. For a business card, which he handed to her. She looked at it. Special Agent Daniel Rourke, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. She looked up at him. "We've been watching Hargrove Memorial for 6 months," he said, "but tonight changed our timeline." He paused. "We have a lot to talk about, Ms. Solis, and some of it is about you." Mara looked at the card for 3 seconds, not because she needed more time to read it, 4 words, a name, an agency, but because she had learned a long time ago that the first response you give to unexpected information is the one people remember, and she wanted hers to be the right one. The sky behind the mountains was doing that pre-dawn thing where it was technically lighter but somehow felt darker, the in-between state that made distances harder to judge. She handed the card back. "Keep it," Rourke said. "I know who DCIS is," she said. "What I don't know is why you're at this hospital at 5 in the morning talking to a suspended nurse." The second agent, younger, maybe 35, with the particular stillness of someone trained to be unreadable, had positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of Rourke. Not flanking, just present. Mara had catalogued it in the first 2 seconds and filed it as professional habit rather than threat posture. Rourke said, "Because the suspended nurse just ran a mass casualty response that we watched from the parking lot for 2 hours, and we want to understand who we're dealing with." "You were in the parking lot." "We've been watching this facility since March. Tonight accelerated some decisions we'd been sitting on." He paused. "Can we find somewhere to sit?" She looked at him. "I'm not going inside that building right now." "Then we'll stand." He told her what he could, which was not everything, but was enough. The Defense Criminal Investigative Service had opened a case on Hargrove Memorial 7 months ago, initiated by a referral from the Colorado Medical Board following an anomalous pattern in Medicare billing submissions linked to surgical procedures. The financial irregularities were significant, but they were the visible surface of something deeper, a pattern of care manipulation, falsified surgical outcome data submitted to federal health programs, and what appeared to be a systematic suppression of internal whistleblowing. 3 prior employees had filed complaints. 2 had resigned under circumstances that the DCIS characterized carefully as not fully voluntary. The 3rd had signed an NDA. Mara listened without moving. "We knew about the campaign against you," Rourke said. "We've been monitoring your HR file since May. Your complaints are part of our documentation. You monitored my file and didn't intervene. We needed the full picture before we moved. If we acted on one piece, the rest would have been buried before we got to it." "People got hurt while you were waiting for the full picture," she said. Her voice was flat, and she meant it to be. Rourke didn't look away. "Yes, that's correct." She appreciated that he didn't add anything to it. A man who defended himself there would have told her everything she needed to know about how much to trust him. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your documentation, the log you've been keeping, dates, incidents, names, everything from the past 11 months, he paused. And your personnel file from your military service. This concrete barrier was cold through her scrubs. She was very tired and her ribs hurt, and she hadn't eaten since 7 the previous evening. My military record is classified. Parts of it. We have a process for accessing what we need, but it goes faster if you cooperate voluntarily, and it matters for what comes next. What comes next? Cutler is going to move against you this morning. Whatever he does tonight in that office, and we believe he's in there right now, it's going to be designed to get ahead of what happened in that ER before anyone can frame it the way it should be framed. He'll try to characterize your presence here tonight as a violation, a safety risk, an unauthorized intrusion. He'll try to bury what you actually did under a formal termination process that makes you look like the problem. Mara looked at the sliding doors. The ER was visible through the glass, the steady motion of a department in its aftermath hours, and she could see the charge desk and the monitors and the faint shapes of people moving in the bays. He's going to try, she said. He has institutional leverage. He's done this before, not at this scale, but the mechanism is the same. He knows how to use a hospital's administrative architecture against individuals who don't have the same access to it. Tell me something I don't know, Agent Rourke. He reached into his jacket and produced a second card. This one handwritten on the back with a cell number. Tonight changed our timeline. We're moving faster than we planned. When Cutler makes his move this morning, I need you to call me before you respond to anything, before you sign anything, before you talk to HR, before you make any decisions about your next steps. He held the card out. Will you do that? She took it. What changed your timeline? Tonight, Dr. Nath documented Cutler's absence during a declared mass casualty event. That goes on record. His failure to respond to pages during a multi-vehicle mass casualty situation is now a formal patient safety event. He paused. And Marcus Webb filed an incident report at 4 a.m. that described, in significant detail, the clinical interventions you made tonight and their outcomes. He listed 7 specific patients. He listed what would have happened to 3 of them without your presence. Mara was quiet for a moment. Webb filed that at 4 in the morning. He did. She looked away at the mountains. The not quite dawn was getting louder now, the sky making up its mind about color. The younger agent spoke for the first time. His name, she would learn later, was Specialist Kowalski, though he hadn't offered that yet. Ms. Solis, he said, the documentation matters, but you should also know, before this morning, before we came outside, we ran your name. I assumed. Your military file has a clearance block. We got what was available at our access level, which isn't much, but what we could see. He paused, and she saw something move across his face that wasn't quite professional neutrality. You were attached to a special operations support element for 31 months. Your deployment record shows 4 combat tours. There are 3 letters of commendation in the accessible portion of your file, and the citations are redacted, but the dates correspond to known mass casualty events in 2 separate theaters. She didn't say anything. Dr. Cutler has been calling you an ordinary nurse for 11 months, Kowalski said. That's an interesting characterization. People see what they expect to see, she said. She stood up from the concrete barrier. Her knee protested, which it did when she'd been cold and still for too long. An old injury from a different life that reminded her of itself at inconvenient moments. I'm going home. I need to sleep and eat and make a phone call to my union rep. If Cutler moves this morning, I'll call you. Rourke nodded. One more thing. She waited. There's someone else we need you to be aware of. Inside the hospital. Someone who has been cooperating with our investigation from the beginning. A member of the clinical staff who has been documenting Cutler's conduct from the inside for 4 months. We haven't told you who it is because we needed to protect that individual's position. But given what happened tonight, we need to consider whether that protection can hold. He met her eyes. We're going to need to make some decisions quickly, and some of those decisions involve you. She held his gaze. Give me 6 hours, she said, then call me. She drove home in the early morning light with the business card on the passenger seat and her hands steady on the wheel and her brain doing the thing it did after major events, not processing exactly, more like cataloging, filing things in order, separating what she could act on from what she couldn't. The mountains were pink now on their eastern faces. The highway was almost empty. She slept for 5 hours, which was 4 more than she'd expected to manage. She woke at 11:14 to 3 missed calls, one from Tricia, one from a number she didn't recognize, one from Rourke, and a voicemail from Douglas Farr's office informing her that a formal termination hearing had been scheduled for 2 p.m. that afternoon. She called Tricia first. "I know about the hearing," Tricia said. "I know about last night, too. Webb's report is already making its way through channels." A pause. "Cutler is moving fast." "He's scared," Mara said. "Scared people are dangerous." "I know, I need to be at that hearing." "Obviously. But Mara?" Tricia's voice shifted to the register she used when she was about to say something she'd thought through carefully. "There are 2 men from a federal agency who called my office this morning asking about the legal status of your employment file. I didn't speak to them." "DCIS," Mara said. "They approached me last night. They've been investigating the hospital." The silence on the line had a quality to it. "How long?" 7 months. Another silence. "And they didn't—" "No, they didn't." She let that sit. "I'm going to the hearing. I need you there. And I need you to know that what I'm going to present in that room is going to be more than an employment dispute. Define more. 11 months of documented harassment, retaliation, and physical assault. 7 patient outcomes from last night that are in writing. And a federal investigation that has Cutler in its scope." She paused. "I'm not walking in there to defend myself, Tricia. I'm walking in there to put everything on the table where people can't look away from it." Tricia was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'll be there at 1:30. She ate, she showered. She pulled up her documentation log on the encrypted drive and reviewed it from the beginning. Not because she'd forgotten anything, but because the act of reading it in sequence reminded her of what it actually was. The record of 11 months of a system, doing what systems did when powerful men decided someone needed to be removed. Reading it made something in her chest go cold and solid, in a way that wasn't anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. She was dressed and ready at 12:40 when her phone rang with a number she didn't have saved. She picked up. "Solis." The voice on the other end was female, young, and tightly controlled in the way of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was afraid to deviate from it. "This is Dr. Nath." Mara sat down on the edge of her kitchen table. "I know your voice, Dr. Nath. I need to tell you something before your hearing. I should have told you before now, but—" A breath. "I've been working with federal investigators since March. I'm the inside contact." Mara was quiet. "I started documenting in February, after a patient died following a procedure where Dr. Cutler falsified the complication record. The patient's family was told it was an unavoidable outcome. I had the original OR notes. I knew it wasn't." Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was the tremor of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "I went to DCIS because I didn't know where else to go. I went to HR twice and both times the complaint disappeared. I didn't know who else in the building was safe." "You could have told me." "I didn't know you. I didn't know what you were. You seemed competent, and I could see what Cutler was doing to you, but I didn't know if you were someone who could be trusted with what I had." "And now?" "Last night changed what I know about you," Nath said simply. "And I think what's coming this afternoon is going to require both of us in that room, not just one." Mara looked out her kitchen window at the ordinary afternoon light. "Are you going to the hearing?" "I called the hospital board chair this morning and informed him that I intend to provide testimony relevant to the investigation of Dr. Cutler. I also sent DCIS a summary of what I told him." A pause. "Cutler doesn't know yet." "He will before 2 o'clock." "Yes." Her voice didn't waver. "I know." Mara thought of Nath standing in that trauma bay at 2 in the morning, jaw tight, eyes moving across 4 simultaneous crises, making a decision to call Mara and that she didn't have to make, and that was going to cost her something regardless of how it played out. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I should have told you sooner." A pause. "I'm sorry I didn't." Mara hung up and sat still for a moment. Then she picked up her documentation log, transferred it to a secure flash drive, put the flash drive in her jacket pocket, and called Rourke. He picked up on the first ring. "Nath just told me she's your inside source," Mara said. "Your cover is going to break in the next 2 hours. Cutler is going to find out before the hearing." Rourke said, "We know. We're adjusting." "How?" "We're going to be at the hearing, not as observers." A pause. "Ms. Solis, the decision we've been sitting on for 2 weeks, we're making it today. There are things that need to happen in that room, and they're going to happen whether or not the timing is perfect. Can you be there and hold your position, regardless of what Cutler does, when the federal peace becomes visible? That's not a hard question, she said. She arrived at Hargrove Memorial at 1:22 p.m. The building looked exactly as it always did. The glass entrance, the institutional planting along the walkway, the Hargrove Memorial sign in the sans serif font. Someone had chosen 20 years ago because it looked modern and stable. She had walked through this entrance hundreds of times over 11 months, and it had never looked different. Today it looked like a place where something was about to end. Tricia was waiting inside near the elevator bank, in a suit jacket and with her leather folio under her arm, and when she saw Mara, she said, "Far moved the hearing to the conference room on 4. Board conference room, not the standard HR space." "Why the boardroom?" "Because Cutler requested it." Tricia's voice was even, but her eyes were sharp. "He's bringing people, Mara. This isn't a standard termination hearing." They rode the elevator together in silence, and Mara counted floors the way she counted everything. And when the doors opened on 4, she saw immediately that Tricia had been right. The conference room had glass walls looking out onto the 4th-floor administrative corridor. Through the glass, she could see that the room was already occupied. Far at the head of the table, 2 board members she recognized by face, a hospital attorney she'd seen once at an all-staff meeting, and Cutler in his white coat despite the administrative context, which was a choice designed to remind everyone in the room what he was. Kyle Ostrowski was not there. She noted his absence. Cutler saw her through the glass. His expression did not change. She went in. Tricia beside her. She sat at the table and placed her flash drive on the surface in front of her and looked at Douglas Farr, who looked back at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally uncomfortable in a way she recognized as the expression of a man who knows the ground under him has shifted but doesn't yet know in which direction. Cutler spoke before Farr had the chance to open formally. "I want to begin by stating for the record that this employee's unauthorized presence in this facility last night represents a serious safety and liability concern." "Dr. Cutler," Tricia said, "you're not the chair of this proceeding." Farr cleared his throat. "We're here to—" The conference room door opened. Rourke came through first, Kowalski behind him, both in their dark jackets, both with their identification cases already in hand, open, held at a height where everyone in the room could see them clearly. Behind them, and this was the part Mara had not anticipated, the adjustment Rourke had mentioned on the phone, was a third person, a woman in her mid-40s in a charcoal blazer, her dark hair cut short, carrying a briefcase and a bearing that said she was not from this institution and had not come to participate in its proceedings, but to impose a different set of proceedings on top of them. The room went quiet, in the specific way that rooms go quiet when they understand that something authoritative has entered. "Special Agent Rourke, Defense Criminal Investigative Service," Rourke said to the room. "This is Specialist Kowalski and Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Haverford." He placed a document on the table, multiple copies, distributed with Kowalski's help across the table's length. "We are here to formally notify this institution of an active federal investigation into fraudulent Medicare and TRICARE billing practices, falsification of surgical outcome records submitted to federal health programs, and systematic retaliation against employees who attempted to report those practices." The attorney Cutler had brought began to say something, and Haverford looked at her, and the attorney stopped. Cutler's face had gone to a color that Mara associated with people who had just understood that the floor they were standing on was not actually solid. "This proceeding," Rourke continued, "touches directly on our investigation. We will be observing. We will be recording. Any actions taken against Ms. Solis in this proceeding that constitute further retaliation under federal whistleblower protection statutes will be documented and included in our case record." He sat down along the side wall, outside the formal table arrangement, in the posture of someone who has said what needs saying and has no intention of saying more than necessary. Farr looked at the document in front of him, then at Cutler, then at the board members, who were looking at each other with the complicated expressions of people realizing that a situation they thought they controlled is no longer what they thought it was. "I think," Farr said carefully, "we need to take a short recess." "We don't need a recess," Mara said. Everyone looked at her. She put her hands flat on the table. "I've had 11 months of recesses. I've had 2 HR complaints that went nowhere. I've had a formal suspension that was filed 20 hours after I reported a physical assault. And that was time to remove me from this building before I could be present during a mass casualty event that demonstrated exactly what this administration has been trying to suppress about my clinical qualifications. She looked at Cutler. I would like to proceed. Cutler said, You're a nurse. You ran a trauma response you had no authority to run. I was authorized by the attending physician present under the hospital's own mass casualty protocol, Section 14, Paragraph 3. She had the document on her flash drive, and she didn't need to look at it. 7 patients received interventions last night that clinical documentation supports were life-preserving. 3 of those patients, she pulled a printed summary from her jacket, placed it on the table, were in immediate risk of fatal deterioration without specific clinical actions that required training beyond the scope of what your available staff had at that moment. You're claiming credit for... I'm not claiming anything. It's in the ER log, signed with my name and license number. It's in Marcus Webb's incident report, filed at 4 a.m. It's in Dr. Nath's shift documentation. She paused. And it's in the statements of 4 nursing staff who were present and who will speak to what they witnessed. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Hollis, who sat on the credentialing committee and who Mara knew by reputation as someone who had come up through nursing before moving into administration, leaned forward. Her expression was hard to read, but she was paying attention with a quality of attention that was different from the other board members in the room. Miss Solis, Hollis said, what exactly is your clinical background? Because I'm looking at your personnel file and it says nursing school in Phoenix and 12 years of general nursing. That's what the file says, Mara said. Is that file accurate? Mara looked at her. Then she looked at Rourke. Rourke gave her nothing. No nod, no signal, just his own stillness, which told her this was her decision. She reached into her jacket and put the flash drive on the table. My military service record is partially classified, she said. What is accessible and what I am authorized to disclose is on that drive, along with 11 months of documented harassment, the HR complaints with their receipt timestamps, the photograph of my injuries from the July assault, and my complete log of every incident I experienced at this facility. She paused. The military portion includes 4 combat deployments, 2 as a special operations medical sergeant attached to a forward surgical element, 2 in a role I am not able to describe in more detail than that. I have performed advanced trauma interventions, including assisted surgery, field blood product management, and mass casualty triage, in conditions that make last night look like a training exercise. She looked at Cutler when she said the last sentence. She hadn't planned to, but she did, and she didn't look away. Dr. Cutler told me I was a nurse and nothing more. He was right about the first part. The room was very quiet. It had the quality of quiet that comes when a group of people has just had their collective understanding of a situation restructured in a way that takes a moment to settle. Hollis said, Why didn't this information appear in your personnel file? Because no one asked for it. I was hired as an ER nurse. I listed my nursing credentials and my civilian work history. My military record is not automatically disclosed. No one from HR or administration requested it, and I did not volunteer it because my military service is in several respects sensitive, and I had no reason to believe it would be relevant. She paused. It turns out it became relevant. Cutler had recovered some of his composure. Not all of it, but some. This doesn't change the fundamental question, which is whether this employee violated the terms of her suspension. Dr. Cutler, Haverford said, and the room shifted toward her with the particular attention given to the person who has been quiet the longest and is now speaking for the first time. I'd like to caution you about the direction you're taking in this proceeding. The individual sitting across from you filed 2 formal complaints against this institution that went unaddressed. She was subjected to a documented pattern of physical intimidation. Her employment suspension was filed within 20 hours of a formal assault complaint. And last night, in her capacity as a credentialed nurse who was granted access by the attending physician of record, she participated in a patient care event that is being independently documented as significant and positive. Haverford's voice was not loud. It had the quality of something being stated for the record rather than argued. If this institution moves forward today with a termination on the basis of the events of last night, the legal posture of that action is going to be something you and your attorneys should think about very carefully. Cutler looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at her hands. The board member to Hollis's right, a man named Gerald Ash, whose background was finance, and who until this moment had been sitting with the careful blankness of someone waiting to see which way things were going, said, "I'd like to call a formal recess." "That's the second request for a recess," Mara said. "Ms. Solis, I'm not trying to be difficult," she said, and she meant it. "I'm trying to understand why the people in this room keep wanting to pause. Every pause benefits the person who has institutional leverage, and that's not me. But if there's a legitimate procedural reason for a recess, I'll respect it." Hollis looked at her for a moment, and in that look was something Mara couldn't fully read. Not sympathy exactly, more like recognition, the look of someone who understood the geometry of the situation from a position that Ash and Farr did not. 20 minutes more. They filed out. Rourke and Kowalski stayed in the room, and Haverford moved to the corner and opened her briefcase. Tricia leaned toward Mara. "You did not tell me about the special operations piece," she said quietly. "I don't tell people things they don't need to know," Mara said. "I'm your union representative." "And now you know." Mara looked at the table. "What's your read?" "Cutler is losing the room. The board members aren't with him the way they were when they came in. Hollis is actively against him. I've dealt with her in 2 other cases, and she has a conscience, and she picks her moments." Tricia paused. "The federal presence changes the calculus for everyone. No board member wants to be the person who voted to terminate a whistleblower while federal agents were sitting in the room." "What about Cutler himself?" Tricia was quiet for a moment. "People like Cutler. When the room turns, they don't accept it gracefully. He's going to look for a move that changes the frame. He'll try to find something that makes you look worse than him." She glanced toward the glass wall where Cutler stood in the corridor with his attorney, his back to the room. "Watch what he does when he comes back in." Mara watched. When the recess ended and the participants filed back into the conference room, the configuration had shifted slightly. Farr was no longer at the head of the table but to one side, and Hollis had taken the central position with a formality that had not been explicitly established, but that everyone in the room accepted without comment. Cutler came in last, which was deliberate, and he stood for a moment before sitting, and in that moment Mara saw what Tricia had been describing. He had something. She didn't know what it was yet, but she recognized the posture of a man who had found a card he thought he could play, and she felt the particular alertness she had learned to trust when a situation was about to change fast. Cutler sat. He looked at Hollis and then at Mara, and he said, "Before we continue, I want to place on record a concern that has emerged during the recess and that I believe is directly relevant to Ms. Solis's fitness for clinical practice." His voice had found its register again. The measured institutional authority of someone who has spent 30 years learning how to make rooms listen to him. "It concerns the nature of her military discharge." Mara felt the room's attention shift. She kept her face still. "I've made a call during the recess to a contact at the Department of the Army," Cutler said, "and I have reason to believe that Ms. Solis's separation from the Army was not standard, that there are circumstances surrounding that separation that are directly relevant to questions about her judgment and her fitness to practice, and that these circumstances were deliberately concealed during her hiring process." He paused, with the timing of someone who has practiced this. "I am requesting that her military separation records be formally subpoenaed before this proceeding continues." The room was silent. Rourke's posture, along the wall, had not changed. Neither had Kowalski's. Haverford was writing something. Mara looked at Cutler, and something that had been cold in her chest all morning went colder and solider, because she understood what he was doing, and she understood that he had found the one piece of her history that was genuinely complicated, the one chapter that she had never been able to condense into a clean narrative, and he was going to try to open it in a room full of people who didn't have the context to understand it. She had 2 choices in the next 4 seconds. She could wait, let the legal process play out, let Haverford and Tricia manage it, control the damage from the outside. Or she could do the thing she had always done in environments where waiting meant seeding the terrain. She opened her mouth, and the conference room door opened for the second time. The man who came through it was in his early 60s. He was in military dress uniform, not the working uniform, the full dress, the one that came out for specific occasions that required its weight to be visible and understood. He wore the insignia of a major general. His ribbons ran 4 rows across his chest and included several that did not appear in public military reference databases. He looked at Cutler. He looked at Mara. He crossed the room without speaking to anyone else, and he stopped at the table and he stood very straight and he brought his right hand up to the brim of his cap. A full military salute. Held. "Sergeant First Class Mara Solis," he said. His voice carried in the way of someone accustomed to being heard in conditions where hearing was difficult. "I am Major General Thomas Aldrich, United States Army Special Operations Command. I apologize for arriving late." He held the salute. The room had gone so quiet that Mara could hear the ventilation system. She stood up, because that was the appropriate response, and because her body did it before her mind decided to, and she returned the salute with the muscle memory of 8 years. Aldrich lowered his hand. He looked at the room, at Cutler, at the board members, at Farr, at Rourke, with the kind of look that took in everything and landed on no one thing for too long, the tactical assessment of a man accustomed to entering rooms and understanding them quickly. "I understand," he said, "that someone in this proceeding has raised a question about the circumstances of Sergeant Solis's military separation." His voice had the absolute evenness of someone who has decided not to be angry because anger is a less effective tool than precision. "I'm here to address that question directly." Cutler said, "General, with respect, this is an internal hospital." "Dr. Cutler." Aldrich looked at him, and Cutler stopped. "Sergeant Solis's separation from the United States Army was a classified administrative action related to the protection of an active special operations program. The nature of that separation has no bearing whatsoever on her fitness for clinical practice, her professional judgment, or her character." He paused. "What I'm able to tell this room is that Sergeant Solis performed 311 documented medical interventions during her time in Special Operations Support, including 47 under direct hostile fire, with a patient survival rate that our command has, on 2 occasions, cited as exceptional informal after-action review." Another pause. "I flew here from Colorado Springs this morning because when I received word that the woman who kept 4 of my soldiers alive in a building that should have killed all of them was being called unfit for clinical practice by a hospital administrator, I decided to come and say something about that in person." The room was not quiet anymore, but the sound it made was not talking. It was the collective exhalation of a group of people who had just had the architecture of their assumptions dismantled simultaneously. Cutler's face had passed through several colors and arrived at something that was not quite gray, but was close to it. His attorney had stopped looking at her hands and was now looking at the general with an expression that was professionally composed but personally uncertain. Hollis said very quietly, 47 interventions under direct hostile fire. "That is correct," Aldrich said. Hollis looked at Mara. And then she looked at Douglas Farr. And then she looked at Cutler with an expression that was not anger. It was something more administrative than anger, more conclusive, the expression of someone who has made a decision and is already thinking about the next step. Mara sat back down. Her knee hurt, her lip hurt. She was the calmest she had been since she walked into this room, because the situation had passed out of the phase where her individual actions could determine the outcome, and into the phase where the weight of accumulated truth was doing its own work, and the only thing she needed to do was stay in her chair and let it. Cutler looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. And then Marcus Webb appeared in the corridor outside the glass wall, and behind him were Deja and Felix and 2 other nurses from the overnight shift, still in their scrubs, and they were not part of this hearing and had not been summoned, and Mara did not know how they'd known to be here, but they were standing in the corridor with the particular stillness of people who have come somewhere on purpose and are waiting to see what's needed. Webb caught her eye through the glass. He pointed at her, then at himself, then at the others behind him. She understood. Cutler saw it too. She watched his eyes track to the corridor, take in the nurses, take in Webb, and she watched something in him begin to calculate and come up short. He turned back to the room. He opened his mouth. And at that exact moment, Rourke's phone buzzed audibly, and Rourke looked at it, and the thing that moved across his face was brief and controlled, but it was there, and he stood up from the wall and said, "Excuse me," and stepped out, and through the glass Mara watched him take the call and watched his posture shift in the way of someone receiving information that requires immediate action. He was back inside in 90 seconds. He looked at Haverford. Something passed between them. Haverford closed her briefcase. She looked at the room with an expression that had changed in a way Mara couldn't fully read. Not less composed, but differently composed, carrying something new that she was in the process of deciding how to handle. We need to pause this proceeding, Haverford said. Mara looked at her. What happened? Haverford looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Mara. Kyle Ostrowski, he said, has just turned himself in to the Caldwell Ridge Police Department. He has given a voluntary statement. He paused. And he has named additional people. The name Kyle Ostrowski had given was not the one anyone in the room expected. Not Dale. Not an orderly or a tech, or one of the rotating cast of minor figures who had participated in the campaign against Mara over the past 11 months. The name Kyle had given to the Caldwell Ridge Police Department in a voluntary statement delivered at 7:43 that morning, while most of the people in this conference room had still been preparing for a hearing they thought they understood, was Douglas Farr. Rourke said it plainly, without inflation, the way investigators delivered information when they wanted the room to hear the fact and not the drama of it. Farr's name, HR Director. The man who had been sitting at the head of this table 30 minutes ago with the carefully neutral expression of an administrator doing his job. Mara looked at the empty chair where Farr had been sitting before the recess. She looked at Rourke. Where is he now? She said. Building security has him in the lobby, Rourke said. He didn't try to leave. That's either very smart or very stupid. He was already moving toward the door. Kowalski. Kowalski was already up. The conference room reorganized itself in the 30 seconds after Rourke left, the board members leaning toward each other in low, urgent consultation. The hospital attorney on her phone with the hand cupped over her mouth. Haverford standing at the window with her briefcase under her arm, looking at the middle distance with the focused stillness of someone building a structure in their head. Tricia had her legal pad out and was writing fast. General Aldrich stood near the door with his hands behind his back, and the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the outcome of things he had already set in motion. Cutler had not moved. He sat at the table with his hands flat on its surface, and he was looking at a point somewhere past Mara's left shoulder, and the color had gone out of his face in a way that made him look like a different person than the one who had walked into this room an hour ago. The authority he wore like a physical object, the white coat, the set of his jaw, the particular way he occupied space that said he expected to be deferred to, had not disappeared exactly, but it had become visible as a thing he was wearing rather than a thing he was. And once that happened in a room, there was no way to make it stop happening. Mara watched him and felt nothing she'd expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not relief. Something quieter and less clean. The feeling of a thing coming to its end that has been in motion for so long that its ending didn't produce resolution, so much as a kind of exhausted recognition. Patricia Hollis ended her consultation with the other board member and looked across the table. Ms. Solis, she said, I want to be direct with you. The board did not have full visibility into what has been happening in this institution. I want you to understand that I'm saying that not as a legal statement, but as a personal one. I understand the distinction, Mara said. What I need to ask you, before this proceeding continues in whatever form it takes, Hollis glanced at the door through which Rourke had left, is whether there is anything else we should know. From your documentation, from your knowledge of this facility, anything that isn't already on the table. Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket and produced a second flash drive. Not the same one she'd placed on the table earlier. A different one, smaller, which she'd carried in her interior breast pocket for 6 weeks, and which she had not mentioned to Tricia or to Rourke or to anyone, because she had learned in a different life that certain information was most useful when it was not announced in advance. She set it on the table. That drive contains documentation of 4 specific patient cases, she said. Patients who underwent surgical procedures overseen by Dr. Cutler over the past 18 months. In each case, I became aware of discrepancies between the clinical picture I observed as the nursing staff during post-op care and the official complication record in the patient's file. She kept her eyes on Hollis and not on Cutler. I was not the attending. I was not in the OR. I cannot speak to what happened during the procedures themselves. What I can speak to is what I saw afterward, and what I documented, and what does not match the official record. She paused. One of those patients died. His family was told it was unavoidable. I don't believe it was. The room processed that. Hollis reached out and picked up the drive. Cutler said, Those allegations are... Dr. Cutler. Haverford had turned from the window. Her voice had the quality of a door being shut. I would strongly suggest you stop talking. He stopped. His attorney leaned toward him and said something too quiet to hear. Whatever it was, Cutler received it with a small nod, and he straightened in his chair, and he did not speak again. Rourke returned 14 minutes later. He came back into the conference room without Kowalski, which told Mara that Kowalski was still downstairs with Farr, and he sat in the chair he'd been using along the wall, and he looked at Haverford and said, "Kyle Ostrowski's statement is being formalized now. Dale Ostrowski is being contacted. Farr is not talking without an attorney, which is his right. But the statement we have is specific and detailed, and it corroborates the documentary record." He paused. The scope of what Ostrowski described is larger than the harassment campaign. He has described specific conversations with Farr in which Farr acknowledged awareness of the billing irregularities and agreed to use the HR process to neutralize employees who posed a risk of reporting. He looked at the board members when he said the last sentence. Farr has been in that position for 6 years. Gerald Ash, who had spent most of the proceeding in careful silence, said, "Are you telling us that our HR director was complicit in suppressing whistleblower activity on behalf of—" "I'm telling you that Kyle Ostrowski's statement, if it holds, describes a coordination between Dr. Cutler and Mr. Farr that goes back at least 3 years. I'm telling you that we are in the early stages of processing that statement and that the picture may change as we develop it further." Rourke's voice was precise, measured. "I'm also telling you that 2 of the 3 prior employees whose complaints disappeared were handled by Douglas Farr." Ash absorbed this with the expression of a man doing rapid calculations about institutional liability and personal exposure simultaneously. He looked at Hollis. Hollis looked back at him with an expression that said she had already done those calculations and had arrived at a position, and the position was not going to be the comfortable one. Mara was watching Cutler. She had spent 11 months watching Randall Cutler operate, and what she had learned in that time was that he was a man who functioned by maintaining control of the information environment around him, who knew what, who could access what, who could be reached, and who could be isolated. The thing that made him effective was not intelligence exactly, though he was intelligent, but a kind of relentless management of the space between what was true and what could be proven. He had been doing it for 30 years, and he had been good enough at it that almost nobody had been able to make the distance between those two things visible. She was watching him now, and what she was watching was a man who had run out of room. It happened visibly, not dramatically. No raised voices, no breaking point, no moment of theatrical collapse. Just the gradual and unmistakable process of a person whose options have been exhausted one by one until there are none left, and who is sitting with that fact and beginning to understand its weight. His posture didn't change, his expression was controlled, but his hands on the table had moved slightly, and the set of his jaw had shifted, and there was something in the stillness around his eyes that was different from the stillness of composure. She had seen that look before. In a different context, in a different country, in rooms where the cost of being caught was more immediate than losing a medical license. The look was the same. He knew it was over. He just didn't know yet what over was going to look like. The proceeding did not conclude that afternoon in any formal sense. What it did was transform from a termination hearing into something that had no clear procedural category, a juncture where a hospital's internal process had intersected with a federal investigation, and the collision had produced a situation that none of the existing protocols could cleanly manage. Haverford adjourned it formally on federal jurisdictional grounds, which gave the board cover to pause without making a decision they'd have to defend later. Hollis extracted a specific commitment from the remaining board members before they left the room, not on the record, but said aloud in the presence of Rourke and Haverford and Mara, which was as close to the record as made no practical difference, that Mara's suspension was to be administratively reversed pending the investigation's outcome, and that no further adverse action would be taken against her or against Dr. Nath. Cutler's attorney requested a private conversation with Haverford that lasted 22 minutes in a side room. Mara didn't know what was said. Rourke afterward told her it was what he'd expected: early exploratory movement toward cooperation, conditional on various protections, nothing formalized yet. "That's how it starts," he said. "They don't believe it's real until they see the room change." She had gone to find Nath after the proceeding, and she'd found her in the stairwell at the end of the 4th-floor corridor, sitting on a step with her phone face down in her lap, not on a call, just sitting. Nath looked up when she heard the door, and her face had the emptied-out quality of someone who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has just released it and hasn't yet felt what that release costs. How are you doing? Mara asked. It was a simple question, and she meant it simply. Nath made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I've been undercover in my own department for 4 months, she said. I have no idea how I'm doing. Mara sat down on the step above her. The stairwell smelled like institutional paint and concrete. Ostrowski's statement is going to corroborate your documentation, she said. You'll be designated a cooperating witness. That has specific legal protections. I know about the legal protections. Nath looked at the floor. What I don't know is how to go back out there and be a doctor in that building. A pause. Some of those people, the attendings, the senior nurses, they knew something was wrong and they looked the other way. Not Deja, not Felix, not Webb, but others. And I have to work with them. You don't have to figure that out today. No. Nath was quiet for a moment. I thought about quitting, multiple times in the past 4 months. Every time Cutler walked past me in that corridor and I had to act like nothing was happening. She stopped. I almost quit in April. What kept you? Nath looked up at her. Honestly, you. Watching what he was doing to you and seeing you come back for every shift anyway. She paused. I kept thinking, if she can stay in that building, I can stay in that building. Mara absorbed that. It was not a comfortable thing to absorb, being cited as someone's anchor when she'd spent 11 months certain she was operating entirely alone. I didn't know you were watching, she said. I know you didn't. Nath picked up her phone, turned it over. I think I need to call someone, not about work. Good idea, Mara said. She left Nath in the stairwell and went down to the ground floor where General Aldrich was waiting near the main entrance with his aide, a young captain who had been present but invisible throughout the afternoon. Aldrich had removed his cap and was holding it at his side, and in the institutional lobby light. He looked older than he'd looked in the conference room, still formidable, but more human, the particular humanity of someone who has expended real effort on behalf of something they believed in and is now in the quiet phase after. You could have told me you were coming, she said. I could have, he said. You would have told me not to. She hadn't considered lying to him about that. Yes. He looked at the lobby, the ordinary hospital lobby, people moving through it with flowers and coffee cups, and the various urgencies of their own situations. I owe you a conversation that's 11 months overdue. You don't owe me anything, General. Mara. He said her first name the way commanding officers sometimes did, without rank, when the rank was beside the point and the person was what mattered. What happened with your separation, the way it was handled, the information that was omitted from your transition file that left you walking into civilian medicine without any of the recognition or the credentials that you had earned. He stopped, started again. That was wrong. It was a process failure, and it resulted in a circumstance where you could be characterized as an ordinary nurse by a man who should never have had the power to characterize you at all. She looked at him. The separation was classified for legitimate reasons. The separation was classified. The commendations were not required to be. The letters of citation were not required to be. He held her gaze. Decisions were made about what to include in your transition record that left you exposed. I have been trying for 4 months to get that corrected through appropriate channels, and 4 months ago was already too late. He paused. I should have started sooner. She didn't know what to do with that. Not the apology itself, which she had not expected, but the admission of process failure from a man who had operated at levels where admitting failure was not a reflex but a deliberate act. She filed it for later, when she'd have the space to actually examine it. What happens now, she said, with the separation record? We are initiating a formal review. The relevant citations will be added to your accessible file with appropriate classification markings. Your rank and qualifications will be reflected accurately. He paused. And I am personally recommending you for a retroactive commendation for the events of last night, which, from what I have been told, were representative of your capabilities. She almost said it wasn't necessary. She almost said the work was its own justification, which she believed, and which was also a habit she'd developed in environments where calling attention to individual achievement was sometimes a liability. She caught the reflex and set it aside. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded once. He put his cap back on. You should know, he said, That the 4 soldiers you kept alive in that building in Kunar province include one who is currently serving as a company commander at Fort Carson. He called me this morning when he heard what was happening here. A pause. He wanted me to tell you he still has the field dressing you applied. He kept it. She looked at the floor for a moment. She had a policy about not thinking about specific cases from the field. Not suppression, just postponement. The knowledge that those memories required space she didn't always have available. She made a note to revisit that one later. Tell him I said congratulations on the command, she said. Aldrich left. His aide followed. And Mara stood in the lobby of Hargrove Memorial for a moment alone, surrounded by the ordinary business of a hospital in its afternoon hours. And she let the afternoon settle around her the way you let weight redistribute after carrying something heavy. The next 72 hours moved the way the aftermath of major events always moved. In irregular bursts of intensity between long stretches of waiting, the machinery of consequence grinding at its own pace, regardless of how fast or slow anyone on the ground wanted it to go. Kyle Ostrowski's statement was formalized by 5 p.m. on the day of the hearing. Dale Ostrowski was contacted by DCIS and declined to make a statement without an attorney, which was noted. Douglas Farr remained in federal custody pending a bail determination. The hotel 2 blocks from the hospital filled with investigators over the following 24 hours, and Haverford's team established a working office in the hospital's administration wing, which the remaining board members had authorized with a unanimity that spoke less to principle than to the recognition that the alternative was to look obstructive. Cutler remained in the building. That was the thing that surprised people who hadn't thought it through. That he didn't leave immediately, didn't resign, didn't vanish. He continued to come in, to walk the corridors, to appear in meetings that no one had yet formally removed him from, because the administrative processes that would change his status were moving at their own rate, and until they completed, he retained his position on paper. And Randall Cutler was, above all things, a man who held his ground until the ground was physically removed from under him. Mara watched him from a distance. She was back on shift. Hollis had personally authorized her return, badge reinstated, the suspension reversed in writing, all of it documented and time-stamped. And she worked her shifts with the same economy and the same steadiness she had always worked them, and the department around her was different and the same simultaneously. Different because the dynamic had shifted in a way that everyone could feel even when they didn't name it. Same because patients came in with their ordinary emergencies and needed what they needed and didn't care about the institutional drama above them, which was the thing Mara found most stabilizing about emergency medicine, that it was fundamentally indifferent to everything except the immediate problem. On the second day after the hearing, Marcus Webb found her in the supply room at end of shift. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about the incident report I filed." She was inventorying oxygen supplies and she kept counting. "What about it?" "I wrote it at 4 in the morning because I was afraid that if I waited until a reasonable hour, I'd talk myself out of it." He leaned against the doorframe. "Or that someone would talk me out of it." "Who would have talked you out of it?" He was quiet for a beat. "Cutler made a comment to me before the mass casualty event, a couple weeks ago. He said that my career trajectory in this department was going to depend on my ability to demonstrate loyalty to the institution and its leadership." His voice was even, but his jaw was tight. "I understood what he meant." "But you filed, because I watched you work that night." He stopped. Started again, differently. "I've been in this hospital for 8 months, and I've been watching the people who should be teaching me, and what I've learned is mostly what not to do. And then I watched you run a mass casualty response with resources you shouldn't have needed to manage, and I thought," he stopped, "I thought, that's what it's supposed to look like, and someone needs to say so." She looked at him directly. "You're going to be a good physician." He looked like he didn't know what to do with that. "I mean it," she said. "You got to the tension pneumo. You stayed in the fight when you were out of your depth, and you didn't let your ego make decisions about what you could and couldn't handle. That's not something they teach you." She went back to counting. "That's something you either have or you don't." He left. She finished the inventory. On the third day, Cutler's attorney filed for an emergency stay of the federal investigation on jurisdictional grounds, which Haverford's team opposed, which the federal judge denied in 4 hours. The denial was not public in its details, but the fact of it moved through the hospital's administrative layer with the speed that institutional news always traveled. the informal network that processed information faster than any official channel. On the fourth day, Dale Ostrowski came in, not to Mara directly, to Rourke's temporary office in the administration wing, with an attorney and with a statement that Rourke described to Mara that evening in the brief, careful way he had of delivering significant information. Dale Ostrowski had corroborated his brother's account of the harassment campaign. He had added specifics. He had described 3 separate conversations with Cutler in which Cutler had explicitly directed the escalation of physical intimidation against Mara, not as a direct order, but as the kind of clear enough communication that left plausible deniability intact, the kind Mara had recognized from the beginning even when she couldn't prove it. He also described, Rourke said, a conversation with Douglas Farr in which Farr told him that Mara's HR complaints had been managed, his word, managed, and that there was no risk of them going anywhere. Mara was quiet. And he described a third conversation, Rourke said, this one directly relevant to the mass casualty night, the on-call trauma surgeon who didn't respond to pages. That wasn't an accident. He paused. Dale Ostrowski was present when Cutler told the trauma surgeon on call that if he came in that night, he was not going to find a department worth coming in for. She looked at him. He actively blocked the trauma response. We believe so, yes. We're still developing that piece, but Ostrowski's account is specific enough to warrant pursuing. Rourke's voice was steady, but his eyes were not exactly calm. That is going to be the most serious charge we bring, Mara. Deliberately obstructing emergency medical response during a declared mass casualty event. If we can establish it, that's not a licensing matter. No, she said, it's not. She drove home that evening with the windows down because the mountain air had gone cool and dry the way it did in the late summer evenings, and she wanted the sensation of it. She thought about the trauma surgeon who hadn't come in, who had sat at home while 7 people teetered on the edge of outcomes that the presence of an experienced physician might have changed further. She thought about the 4 people in that department who had given everything they had, Webb, Deja, Felix, Nath, and how much of what they'd been able to do had depended on a sequence of circumstances that included someone being in that parking lot who had been locked out of the building. She thought about how close the whole thing had been. She did not sleep well. She never slept particularly well after extended high-stress periods. Her brain took time to downshift from operational tempo to something quieter, and it did that work at night whether she wanted it to or not. She lay awake for 2 hours reviewing the topology of the past 11 months, the way she'd been trained to review terrain, looking for what she'd missed, what she'd overlooked, what had happened that she hadn't accounted for. The conclusion she arrived at, as she usually did, was that she'd done the things she could do with the information she had, and that the things she hadn't known had been outside her access at the time, and that this was the limit of what any individual could honestly assess about their own decisions. She fell asleep at 2:14 a.m. On the 5th day, the board voted. It was not a public meeting. It was not announced in advance. Mara learned about it from Hollis, who called her at 8 in the morning and said, very simply, the board has voted to suspend Dr. Cutler's clinical privileges pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The vote was unanimous. I wanted you to hear it from me. Mara said, thank you. We're going to need to make some other decisions in the coming weeks about leadership structure, about the trauma program. A pause. I want you to be available for those conversations, Mara. I'll be here, she said. She arrived at the hospital for her shift at 11 and walked through the ER entrance, badge reading green, door opening, the ordinary, unremarkable transit of a person going to work. And the department was as it always was, moving and noisy and demanding in the particular way of a trauma floor that never fully stopped. Deja was at the charge station. She looked up when Mara came in, and something in her face did the same thing it had done in the early hours of the mass casualty night. That expression that was not quite a smile but contained something warmer than neutral. Heard about Cutler, she said. News travels, Mara said. In this building, it does. She tilted her head toward the board where the bay assignments were listed. Bay assignments are up. Busy morning. Mara looked at the board. 7 patients, 4 active bays, a pediatric respiratory case coming up from triage. Ordinary work. The kind of work that had been happening every day she'd been in this building, through every meeting and hearing and HR complaint and late-night documentation session. She put her bag in her locker. She pulled on her gloves. She went to work. At 2:15 that afternoon, Rourke appeared in the ER entrance in civilian clothes without Kowalski, which meant this was not an official visit, and he found her between patients at the medication station and said quietly, "We need to talk, not here." She looked at his face. "What happened?" "Nothing bad," he said. "Something we need to prepare for." He glanced around the floor. "We've been in contact with the Caldwell Ridge DA's office since yesterday. Haverford and the DA are coordinating on the state charges." He paused. "Cutler's attorney contacted us this morning. He wants to make a proffer. He wants to cooperate. He wants to negotiate the terms of cooperation, which means he has something to trade." Rourke's voice was quiet and level. "And he specifically requested that whatever arrangement he reaches include a meeting with you." Mara set down the medication chart she'd been holding. "Why?" "His attorney didn't say, but Haverford thinks he wants to deliver something directly, something he's been holding that has relevance beyond the scope of the current case." He met her eyes. "She thinks he knows about something we haven't found yet." Mara looked at the bay doors, at the monitors, at the department she had fought to stay in for 11 months against a man who was now asking to sit across a table from her. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Rourke said, "if you agree." She looked back at him. She thought about the patient whose death had not been avoidable. She thought about the family that had been told it was. She thought about the 3 prior employees whose complaints had been managed, and the NDA one of them had signed, and the question she had not yet found the answer to, which was whether the one who'd signed an NDA had signed it freely or under pressure that had a name attached to it. She thought about 11 months of a log on an encrypted drive, entry by entry, each one a small and careful act of a person who had decided that documentation was the only weapon she had available and had used it accordingly. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." Rourke nodded and left, and she went back to her patient, and the afternoon moved forward with its ordinary urgencies, and she did not let herself think about the morning until she had finished her shift and driven home and made dinner and sat down at her kitchen table in the quiet of her own apartment. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up her documentation log. She scrolled to the first entry, July of the previous year, time-stamped at 4:11 a.m., 3 lines describing a scheduling irregularity. She scrolled forward through 11 months of it, the accumulation of small things that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything, the record of a campaign that had been waged with the confidence of people who believed no one was watching, no one was keeping track, no one who could be dismissed and isolated and shoved into a supply cart in a hospital corridor would have the presence of mind to build a case while the dismissal was happening. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Her phone lit up on the table beside her. Not Rourke, not Tricia. A number she didn't recognize, area code she didn't know, message that came in as a text and not a call. She picked it up. "Miss Solis, my name is Andrea Voss. 2 years ago, I was a compliance officer at Hargrove Memorial. I signed an NDA on the advice of my attorney, and I have been living with that decision ever since. I saw the news about the investigation. I want to talk. I want to tell you what I found before they made me sign it away. Please call me." Mara read the message twice. She set the phone down. She picked it up again. Whatever Cutler was planning to bring to that table tomorrow morning, Andrea Voss had just told her there was something he didn't know she already had access to. She called the number. Andrea Voss spoke for 41 minutes. Mara sat at her kitchen table with a notepad she didn't end up writing on because what Voss was describing didn't require notes. It had the coherence of something that had been organized and reorganized in one person's memory over 2 years of living with it, the kind of clarity that comes not from distance but from proximity, from turning a thing over in your hand so many times you know every edge of it. Voss had been a compliance officer at Hargrove Memorial for 3 years. She had been hired specifically to audit billing practices after a routine CMS review had flagged a cluster of anomalies in the surgical department's Medicare submissions. She had found what she'd been sent to find, and then she had found considerably more than that. And what she had found beyond the billing irregularities was a secondary set of records, not digital, physical, maintained in a filing system in a locked cabinet in a secondary administrative office that was technically assigned to the chief of surgery's support staff, but was practically inaccessible to anyone outside Cutler's immediate circle. The records documented a pattern of what Voss described, carefully and precisely, as outcome management. Cases where postoperative complications had been reclassified after the fact. Cases where the documentation of a patient's deterioration had been altered to shift the causal narrative away from the surgical procedure and toward pre-existing conditions. Cases where family communications had been scripted by someone other than the attending physician. One of those cases was a 63-year-old man named Raymond Halliday, whose family had been told his death following a routine gallbladder procedure was the result of an undetected cardiac condition. Voss had found the original operative note in that cabinet, time-stamped 40 minutes before the amended version in the official record, and the two versions were not reconcilable. The original described a complication during the procedure. The amended version did not mention it. Mara had asked, "What happened to the original note?" "I made a copy before I reported it," Voss said. "I still have it." She had reported it to Douglas Farr. Farr had told her the discrepancy was under internal review and that she should not discuss it with anyone while that review was in progress. 3 weeks later, she had been called into a meeting with Farr, the hospital attorney, and a partner from an outside law firm, and she had been told that her employment was being terminated due to a restructuring of the compliance function, and that she was being offered a severance package that required the signing of a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of receipt. Her own attorney had told her to take it. She had been 31, she had a lease and student loan debt, and no other job lined up, and she had taken it. "I have not stopped thinking about Raymond Halliday's family for 2 years," she said. Her voice was controlled, but it was controlled the way a person controls something that is pushing against the container from the inside. "I told myself the investigation would catch it. I told myself someone else would find what I found. I told myself the NDA only covered what I said publicly and not what I gave to investigators." A pause. "I don't know if that last part is legally true, but I need it to be true enough to make this call." "Where is the copy of the original operative note?" Mara said. "In a safety deposit box in Denver. I have had it there for 2 years. Another pause. "I want to give it to the federal investigators. I want to give them everything. I want you to know that I know it doesn't fix what I did by waiting." "You called," Mara said. "Make the call to Rourke tonight." She gave Voss the number. She hung up. She sat in the quiet for another moment, then she called Rourke herself, told him to expect to hear from a woman named Andrea Voss within the hour, and told him what Voss had described in the broad strokes without the specifics, because the specifics were Voss's to give on her own terms. Rourke was silent for a moment after she finished. "Halliday," he said. "We have that name in our financial records. His estate filed a complaint with the medical board 14 months ago. It was dismissed for insufficient evidence. It was dismissed because the original operative note was in a locked cabinet, and the only person who knew about the copy just called me," Mara said. "Yes," he said. "Then, how did she find you?" "She said she saw the news about the investigation." Mara looked at her kitchen wall. "And that she'd been waiting for 2 years for the right moment and decided this was it." "People make those decisions on their own timeline," Rourke said. He didn't say it with judgment, just as a fact. "I'll take the call." She went to bed. She slept better than she had the night before. Not well, but better, the sleep of someone whose list of unknowns has shortened by one significant item. The meeting with Cutler's attorney was at 9 a.m. It was held in a conference room at the Federal Building downtown, not at the hospital, which was the correct choice and which Haverford had insisted on. The room was smaller than the hospital's boardroom and had no glass walls and no view, just a table and chairs, and the particular fluorescent flatness of a government building that had been built for function and not impression. Mara arrived with Tricia at 8:52. Rourke and Kowalski were already there. Haverford came in at 8:58 with a second attorney from her office. Cutler arrived at 9:04, which was the first time he had been in a room with Mara since the hearing, and which he managed with the composure of someone who had spent the intervening days rebuilding a version of himself that could walk into this room and function. He was not in his white coat. He was in a dark suit, and he looked like what he was. A man in his 50s who had built an empire in a specific institution and was watching that empire's structural supports fail one by one. But he was upright, and his eyes were clear, and he sat down across from Mara and looked at her with an expression she could not easily categorize. Not defiance, not defeat, something in between that was more complicated than either. His attorney opened. The proffer framework. The conditions Cutler was proposing. His willingness to provide detailed testimony regarding the billing practices, the outcome falsification, and the coordination with FAR in exchange for specific sentencing considerations. Haverford listened. Rourke listened. Mara listened. Then Haverford said, "Before we discuss terms, I need to inform you that our investigation received new evidence yesterday evening relevant to the Halliday matter. Physical documentary evidence, including an original operative note dated the day of Mr. Halliday's procedure, that is materially inconsistent with the official record." She placed a single sheet on the table, not the document itself, a summary, and slid it toward Cutler's attorney. "This changes the scope of the charges we're considering significantly." The attorney read the summary. Her expression did not change, but she stopped moving. That kind of stillness was its own information. Cutler looked at the summary without touching it. Something moved across his face. It was not dramatic. It was the very quiet, very private expression of a man who has just understood that the thing he planned to trade has already been found, which meant the leverage he walked in with had already been removed, and what he was left with was considerably less than what he'd calculated. He looked at Mara. She looked back. He said quietly, without his attorney's intervention, "The Halliday complication was my fault." The room shifted. "I made an error in the procedure. I recognized it intraoperatively. I managed it to the best of my ability, and the patient's outcome was not solely determined by that error. He had underlying conditions that contributed, but the error occurred and I amended the documentation because He stopped. His jaw worked. "Because I had never had a patient die on my table before, and I did not know how to hold both things simultaneously. The error and the identity I had built around not making errors." He looked at his hands. "That is not an excuse. I'm aware it's not an excuse." Haverford said, "Is that statement going on the record?" The attorney put a hand on Cutler's arm. He looked at her. She gave him a small, tight shake of her head. He looked back at the table. "We'll include it in the formal proffer," the attorney said. The meeting lasted another 90 minutes. The legal architecture of cooperation, immunity provisions, sentencing exposure, the choreography of consequence that Mara had no real stake in beyond the fact of its existence. She sat through it, and she listened, and she answered the questions that were directed at her, and she signed the documents that Tricia indicated she should sign. And when it was done, she walked out of the federal building into the September morning with Tricia beside her. "That statement he made," Tricia said, "about Halliday. I know. It doesn't fix what the family went through." "No," Mara said. "It doesn't." They stood on the sidewalk in the early autumn light, and Mara thought about what Cutler had said. The error and the identity built around not making errors. She had understood it. That was the uncomfortable thing. She hadn't forgiven him, and she wasn't going to. And understanding was not the same as forgiveness, but she had understood it because she had spent 8 years in environments where mistakes cost lives, and the mechanism Cutler had used to avoid facing his mistake was a mechanism she recognized from people she had respected, people who had broken under the weight of what they'd done and found ways to rewrite it rather than carry it. The difference was not that he had made an error. The difference was what he'd built on top of the error. The cover-up, the system, the 11 months of deliberate campaign against anyone who might find the thread. The error was human. Everything after it was a choice. She went back to the hospital. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not clean. It never was. The dissolution of something corrupt that has been embedded in an institution for years was not a single event but a long process of extraction, each piece requiring its own procedure, its own documentation, its own legal and administrative handling. Mara worked her shifts through all of it. She gave testimony twice. She provided her documentation to Haverford's team in 3 separate formal sessions. She attended one meeting with the board that lasted 4 hours and covered the structural failures that had allowed the situation to develop and persist. And she said the things that needed saying in that room with the same directness she'd brought to every room in this building. And the board members listened in the way people listen when they have finally run out of reasons not to. Douglas Farr was charged with obstruction, conspiracy, and accessory to fraud. He did not cooperate. His case was built without him. Dale Ostrowski's cooperation earned him a reduced charge and a suspended sentence. He left the hospital and did not return. Kyle Ostrowski was charged with assault and battery. He pleaded guilty. He received a sentence that his attorney described as harsh, and that the Caldwell Ridge victim advocate described as proportionate. Randall Cutler's formal charges were filed 8 weeks after the proffer meeting. Wire fraud, healthcare fraud, obstruction of justice, falsification of medical records, and in the Halliday matter specifically, a charge that the DA's office characterized as criminally negligent conduct resulting in death. The total exposure ran to decades. The cooperation agreement reduced it significantly. He would still spend years in a federal facility. He would never practice medicine again. His license was surrendered on the day the charges were filed by his attorney without a hearing. Raymond Halliday's daughter, a woman named Cecile, who was 38 and lived in Aurora and had spent 14 months trying to get a medical board investigation to go anywhere, was contacted by Haverford's office on the day the Halliday charge was filed. Mara did not know what that conversation was like. She did not ask. But 2 weeks later, she received a handwritten letter with no return address. And the handwriting was someone's who was not accustomed to writing by hand, and it said only, "We found out the truth. Thank you for being part of why." She kept the letter. The formal recognition came on a Thursday in October, which was a choice the Army had made and which Mara had not been consulted about, though she was not surprised by it. The ceremony was held in the hospital's main conference room, not the boardroom on 4, the larger one on the ground floor, the one used for all staff meetings. And the attendance was not mandatory, but it was full, which told its own story about how the department had changed. General Aldrich presided. He was in dress uniform again, and his aide was beside him, and there were 2 other officers present whose specific roles Mara was not told, which meant their presence was about the record and not the occasion. The commendation was read aloud. It covered her service record in the portions that were not classified, which were more than she'd expected. Apparently, the review Aldrich had initiated had moved faster than military reviews typically moved, which told her he had applied weight to it. The language was formal and precise and described things she had done in places she still could not name in a register that made them sound different than they had felt at the time, which was always the case with commendations, and she had known that going in and had prepared herself for it. What she had not prepared herself for was Deja. At the end of the formal remarks, before the room was released, Deja stood up from the second row without being called on and said, "I want to say something." Aldrich looked at her. He gave a small nod. Deja was not a public speaker. She stood with her arms at her sides and she spoke looking at Mara directly, not at the room. "I was there that night," she said. "The mass casualty night. I was scared. Not because of the patients. I knew how to handle patients. I was scared because it was clear that nobody in that building was going to be able to hold it together without someone to follow. And I didn't see that person anywhere." She paused. And then she walked in, not in a cape, not announcing anything. She walked in and she started asking our names and she started giving us directions. And the directions made sense. And after about 10 minutes, I stopped being scared because I was just working. Another pause. She didn't do that because she was trying to be a hero. She did it because the work needed doing and she was the person who could do it. She looked at Mara. "I just wanted someone to say that out loud in a room." She sat down. Marcus Webb, in the row behind her, was looking at his hands, but his shoulders were doing the things shoulders do when someone is working to keep their face composed. Felix, 3 seats down, was not working as hard. Mara stood at the front of the room and she held it together, mostly, which was the honest way to describe it. Not perfectly composed, not undone, somewhere in the human middle of those 2 things where most real moments actually live. After the ceremony, Patricia Hollis asked to speak with her privately. They found a corner of the corridor outside the conference room, and Hollis said, "The board wants to formalize something we discussed in the immediate aftermath of the hearing. The hospital is establishing a new position, Director of Trauma Systems and Emergency Preparedness. It's designed to oversee the trauma program, coordinate the emergency response infrastructure, and develop training standards for the department that reflect current mass casualty and combat medicine practices." She paused. "We want you in that role." Mara looked at her. "I'm a nurse. You are a sergeant first class in the United States Army Special Operations Medical Corps with a record of clinical performance that exceeds that of most physicians in this building, and a demonstrated capacity to lead under conditions that we have now documented thoroughly." Hollis's voice was even, but not neutral. There was something behind the evenness that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it, the tone of someone who has thought carefully about what they're saying and means it. The position is being designed around what the hospital actually needs, not around a pre-existing job category. We'd like you to help define it. She paused. Will you at least consider it? Mara thought about the conference room she'd just left. The full attendance. Deja standing up without being called on. Webb's shoulders. The handwritten letter in her jacket pocket that she'd put there this morning because she'd wanted it near her today. She thought about 11 months of double shifts and locked doors and a log on an encrypted drive, and the decision she'd made at 12:40 in the morning to get dressed and drive to a hospital that had suspended her without pay and stand in its parking lot and wait. She thought about what she'd told Rourke when he'd asked her why she'd stayed in the city during those 11 months, rather than leaving, finding a different position somewhere. The name Randall Cutler wasn't on every door. She had told him, because leaving felt like agreeing with him, because leaving felt like accepting that the space he was trying to clear her from was his to clear, and it wasn't. Because she had spent 8 years in places where the cost of seeding terrain was measured in things worse than professional inconvenience, and she had not been able to make herself feel that the principle was different now just because the stakes were lower. The stakes had not, it turned out, been lower. They had just been different. Yes, she said to Hollis. I'll consider it. Hollis nodded. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. The board voted yesterday to fund an external review of the 3 prior employees whose complaints were suppressed under FAR. The intent is to determine whether restitution is appropriate in each case. She paused. That was Ash's motion. I want you to know that because I know you probably don't expect it from him. People surprise you, Mara said. Sometimes, Hollis agreed. Not often enough, but sometimes. She left. Mara stood in the corridor for a moment longer, and then she walked back to the ER. The department was in its late afternoon rhythm, busy enough to require full attention, settled enough that the rhythm was manageable. Mara changed into her scrubs. She pulled her hair back. She stood at the charge station and looked at the board. 2 critical cases, 1 incoming transfer, a pediatric respiratory presenting from triage, a broken wrist that had been waiting longer than it should have. The ordinary architecture of a day's emergencies, each one the most important thing in the world to the person inside it. She went to work. What she understood, working that shift, was something she had been working toward understanding for 11 months without knowing that was what she was doing. It was not a lesson she'd learned cleanly. Nothing real was learned cleanly. But it had a shape now that it hadn't had before. And the shape was this, that the system she had spent nearly a year fighting had not been stronger than her. It had been more established. Those were different things. Strength was something you could develop, deploy, direct. What Cutler had built was infrastructure, a network of permission and protection that reinforced itself precisely because it was rarely challenged by someone who understood how to challenge it from inside and below rather than from outside and above. She had challenged it from inside and below. She had done it with 11 months of meticulous documentation and a refusal to accept that the space she occupied was his to define. And the infrastructure had failed not because it was weak, but because it was not built to hold against someone who kept showing up. That was the thing about being underestimated. It was a disadvantage and a leverage point simultaneously. People who underestimated you stopped watching you carefully. They stopped accounting for you in their calculations. They assumed your silence was surrender, and your steadiness was resignation, and your absence of dramatic response was the absence of any response at all. They did not consider that you were building a case. She was in Bay 3 at 6:40 p.m. when Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway, looking like he had a question he wasn't sure how to ask. "The new position they're creating," he said. "Are you going to take it?" "I haven't decided." "You should." He said it simply, without decoration. "Not because you owe this hospital anything. Because the residents who are coming up through this program are going to be trained by whoever takes that job, and it matters who that person is." He paused. "I learned more on one mass casualty night watching you work than I learned in 8 months of proper rotations. That's not a criticism of the program. It's just true." She looked at him. "You'd make a decent argument, Webb." "I've been told." He started to leave, then stopped. The tension pneumo patient from that night, the one presenting as PEA. She was discharged last week. Her name is Gloria. She left a card at the nursing station, addressed to the team. Another pause. "She didn't know your name. She wrote the team because she said everyone worked on her at once, and she couldn't tell who was doing what." He met her eyes. I thought you'd like to know that's how it looked from inside it. He left. She thought about that for the rest of the shift. The way it had looked from inside it, the patient's view of a team working, indistinguishable from one another. The individual decisions and corrections and escalations resolved from that angle into a single collective motion. She had spent 11 months being made to feel invisible in this building, and here was Gloria, who had been dying in Bay 2 on the worst night the department had ever had. And what Gloria had seen was not a hierarchy or a power struggle or a suspended nurse operating without authorization. She had seen the team. At 9:15 p.m., the last patient on her board was transferred and her shift technically ended. But she spent another 20 minutes at the station updating notes because she had always done that, the last 20 minutes of documentation that most people skipped. And it was during those 20 minutes that the ER was briefly quiet enough that she could hear the ambient sounds of the building. The elevator, the ventilation, the distant paging system, the muffled motion of a hospital running through the night on the people who kept it running. She had driven to this building at 11:49 p.m. on a Tuesday with a news alert on her phone and no job and nowhere to be. And she had stood in its parking lot and decided to wait because the work needed doing, and she was the person who could do it. Nothing about that decision had been clean or easy or certain. She had not known it would end this way. She had not known it would end any particular way. She had made the decision in the dark, in the cold, in the parking lot of a place that had tried to make her feel like she didn't belong in it. And the decision had been, I am still here. She submitted her notes. She signed off on the board. She picked up her bag. The CEO of Hargrove Memorial, a man named Warren Pell, who she had met twice in 11 months and who had not been present at any of the events of the past 6 weeks, but who had sent a formal letter of apology to her home address that she had read once and then set aside for later, was standing near the ER entrance when she came out of the locker room. She didn't know if he'd been waiting or if it was coincidence, and she decided it didn't matter. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has prepared what he wants to say and is now finding that the prepared version is insufficient. After everything this institution did, he said, you stayed. You came back every shift. Even when we'd suspended you, you came to the parking lot. He stopped. I want to understand why. She thought about the question. She thought about giving him the answer she'd given Rourke about seeding terrain, or the answer she'd given herself during the long shifts when the answer had been less philosophical and more basic, because the patients deserved better than the people who had failed them, and the only way to be better than those people was to keep showing up. She gave him the honest version, which was also the simplest one. Because the work doesn't stop being worth doing because the institution fails, she said. The patients who came through those doors didn't know what was happening in the administrative layer above them. They just knew they needed help. She looked at the bay doors. I was trained to help. That doesn't go away because someone decided I didn't belong here. Pell was quiet for a moment. He nodded once, with the nodding motion of someone who has received an answer they needed rather than one they expected. She walked out. The October night was cold and clear, the mountains visible against the dark sky and the way they were visible on nights without cloud cover, the specific clarity of high-altitude autumn, the stars more present than they were at lower elevations. She sat in her car for a minute before starting it, not because she needed to, but because the shift from inside to outside, from the compressed attention of a working shift to the open space of the world beyond the hospital doors, required a moment's acknowledgement. She thought about Cecile Halliday's letter, about Deja standing up in a full conference room and saying what she'd said without being called on, about General Aldrich flying from Colorado Springs in his dress uniform to say, in a room full of administrators, that the woman they had been calling ordinary was not ordinary, had never been ordinary, and they should have known the difference. She thought about Priya Nath in the stairwell, saying, I kept thinking, if she can stay in that building, I can stay in that building. She thought about the camp follower truth that ran underneath all of it, the thing she had known from the beginning but had needed the whole 11 months to fully confirm, that the people who dismiss you are not dismissing what you actually are. They are dismissing what they can see, which is only what you've allowed them to see, which is only what the situation has required you to show. And the gap between what they're dismissing and what you actually are, that gap is not a weakness. That gap is where you build from. She started the car. She drove home through the clear autumn night with the mountains on her right and the city's ordinary lights below her, and the knowledge, not comfortable but solid, That she had started something in that parking lot 11 months ago that had required her to hold her ground through more than she'd known she was going to be asked to hold it through, and that she had held it imperfectly and stubbornly and with 2 hours of sleep and a split lip and a documentation log that nobody but her had believed would matter. It had mattered. She parked. She sat in the lot for a moment. She picked up her phone and called her mother in Pueblo. Her mother picked up on the second ring, the way she always did, and said, "Mija, how was your shift?" "Good," Mara said. "Busy. Normal." "Normal is good." "Yeah," she said. "Normal is good." She sat in the parking lot and talked to her mother about nothing. About the weather, about a show her mother liked, about the neighbor's dog that had learned to open the back gate. She talked about nothing for 20 minutes, and it was exactly what she needed, and she knew it was exactly what she needed, which was a kind of knowledge she'd had to relearn after years in environments where need was a thing you subordinated to function. She was not in those environments anymore. She was a nurse in an emergency room in Caldwell Ridge, Colorado, with a commendation in her file and a job offer she hadn't accepted yet, and a documentation log she no longer needed to keep. And the people who had tried to make that feel like diminishment had lost. And the patients she had shown up for on the worst night of the department's recent history were alive and discharged and writing thank you notes to the team. When she hung up, she sat for one more moment in the quiet. Then she got out of the car and went upstairs and made tea and went to bed. And the last thing she thought before she fell asleep was not about Cutler or the charges or the new position or any of the things that had been the structure of her life for nearly a year. She thought about Gloria, who had been dying in Bay 2 and hadn't known who was working on her, only that someone was, only that the hands were there, only that she was not alone in it. That was enough. That had always been enough. The rest, the recognition, the commendation, the title on the door, that was the record catching up to the truth. The truth had been there all along, in every shift she'd worked, in every entry she'd logged, in every moment she'd stood in a room where she wasn't wanted and done the job anyway. You don't need a room full of people to see you in order to be real. You just have to keep showing up.